Americans for Prosperity North Dakota proudly supported important policy improvements that broke barriers for all North Dakotans this legislative session. From tackling unnecessary and burdensome occupational licensing standards to fighting for tax relief, AFP is proud to have played a part in improving the lives of North Dakotans this year. Join AFP today by visiting www.afpnd.org. This advertisement was paid for by Americans for Prosperity. Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Port. Later in the show, we're going to be talking with David Owen. He is a part of, a spokesman for Legalize ND. That was the organization behind Measure 3 on the 2018 ballot, the recreational marijuana measure. It failed, but with about 40% of the vote. David has been saying that his group is going to take another run at the issue this cycle with a measure that's is formulated to maybe be more palatable to a larger faction of voters, perhaps even a majority. He'll give you some of the details about that, but also speaks to what is a growing schism in the pro-marijuana movement in North Dakota, some faction going on. It's an interesting discussion, and David is pretty confident that things are going to continue to go his way, but I guess we'll see. My Sunday column is actually going to be, if you want to tune in for that in the state's newspapers. I think that the faction that we're describing is going to make the case for legalization, the movement for legalization, less successful going forward, but I guess we'll see. Before we get there, though, I want to circle back to a topic we talked about a little bit earlier this week. On the blog and here on the podcast, I talked about the Fargo City Commission approving pay increases for the city's police officers, firefighters, and some of their public workers. It was a modest pay increase. Didn't really have a problem with the pay increase in and of itself. It was probably deserved. But the thing I didn't like is that the law enforcement officers showed up to the city commission meeting in uniform and sat there and watched the proceeding, and I didn't like that. I called it intimidation. I called it politics. I don't think it's appropriate for police officers to use their uniforms in pursuit of a political goal like that. Now, I've gotten a lot of response to that from a lot of people, including people who work in law enforcement. Some say I'm wrong. Some say I'm right. Waylon Hedegaard, who is the head of the North Dakota chapter of the AFL-CIO labor union, he criticized me in a letter to the editor of the Fargo Forum. Let me read you. I have the full letter linked at sayanythingblog.com, or I'm sure you could track it down on the forum website. I wrote a rebuttal to this at sayanythingblog.com. But let me read you an excerpt for what he's writing. He says, I quote, Rob Port's recent opinion column criticized police and firefighters for attending a city commission meeting while wearing their uniforms, thus intimidating the commission. He then called for this practice to be stopped. Sadly, there seemed to be a growing trend among those on the right and their self-appointed mouthpieces to demand all public employees be submissive to their governmental employers as if they should just be happy that they have a job. This is absurd. No one should have to sit quietly in the face of their government, especially not its employees. The problem with this letter is that Hedegaard is attacking a straw man, literally an argument I didn't make. My position is not that cops should have to be silent on these issues, or cops or firefighters. By the way, I should mention, I didn't mention the firefighters. I didn't see them in any of the pictures. If they wore their uniforms too, I think that's inappropriate. I wasn't aware if they wore their uniforms or not. I haven't been critical of the firefighters. I don't know. I don't think anybody should be wearing their official uniforms to something like this, but I didn't mention the firefighters for what that's worth. My position on the cops, and really any public employee, is not that they have to be silent on politics generally, or even when it comes to public policy which impacts them specifically, such as pay raises. Far from it. Here's what I actually wrote in my original post. I quote, I have no problem with cops, or anyone else for that matter, making their voices heard. They have the same rights as the rest of us, but just as there are strict prohibitions on using U.S. military uniforms in politics, there ought to be similar restrictions on using law enforcement uniforms and equipment. Now, as I argued before, here's why I feel this way. A police officer's uniform is a tool. We give it to them for a specific purpose. And it's not just so that they can be identified as a police officer, but so that a police officer, when entering the sorts of situations that police officers are called to, situations that are often chaotic, situations that are often in need of authority, in need of someone to be in control, the uniform conveys to those officers that authority. It conveys to them that power. Now, that all flows from the taxpayers, right? We commission police officers, we, the public. We pay for them with our tax dollars. We commission them. We give them this power over the rest of us in order to maintain law and order. That's the whole point of the exercise. And the uniform is where all that starts. They put on that uniform and they become an agent of the public. And they're going to go out there and they're going to use the power and the authority that we give them, the power even to arrest us, the power to use force, the power even to use deadly force. We give them that authority, and they go out, and the uniform is the reflection of all of that, which is why the uniform projects that power, right? A police officer shows up, and they have the uniform on, and that is a symbol. That is a message to everyone else that the person is here who has the authority to do things to calm the situation down, to arrest you, to use force against you if necessary. The police officer can do that. That's what that uniform represents. It's a powerful message. And as it should be. I mean, if we can calm down a situation simply by having a uniformed law enforcement officer show up, well, then that's a good thing, right? I mean, officers are trained to use a lot of those sort of things, like their voices, for instance, right? Have you ever watched cops and you hear officers when they're all of a sudden they'll start shouting and using like a really loud, commanding voice? They're trained to do that. Right? Because if they come into that situation and they just overpower everybody else, they get everybody to just calm down and do what they're told. That's what the cop is supposed to be doing, right? Come in and just freeze the situation. Get everybody to knock it off and then create a calmer situation where things can be sorted out. Maybe somebody's got to get arrested or what have you. The uniform is part of that process. And so now when you show up into a political situation where a police officer is not doing the public's work anymore, but instead engaging in politics, which is not the job of a law enforcement officer, right? It's something that all of us citizens are allowed to do as citizens, but it's not part of the duties of a law enforcement officer. So it's essentially their own time, their own private agenda. They shouldn't be able to bring that authority of that uniform with them. They shouldn't be able to use that tool and bring it with them. So my argument here is not that law enforcement officers have to shut up or be quiet or just sit still and let the government do whatever it's going to do to them. That's not my argument at all. I think law enforcement officers can organize. I think law enforcement officers can have a voice on these things. I just don't think that they should do it while in uniform. I don't think that they should do it while invoking the power, invoking the authority that the public gives to them. Because they don't have that stuff inherently. If the public fires them and they're not a cop anymore, they don't have any more authority or power than the rest of us. And so when a law enforcement officer is going to engage in politics, they don't get to bring that power and authority with them. They engage in politics like a citizen, just like the rest of us. That was my argument. That was the point I was trying to make. Again, I don't have a problem with anybody organizing. I don't have a problem with anybody in the public petitioning the government. In fact, I wrote in my original post that if the law enforcement officers had all wanted to do something like buy matching T-shirts. Like maybe the firefighters are going to wear red T-shirts and the police officers are going to wear blue T-shirts, and they're all going to sit out in the audience. So when you look out there, you see all these red T-shirts, you see all these blue T-shirts, and the city commissioners can know, hey, the cops are here, the firefighters are here, they're watching us make these decisions. I'm fine with that. I don't have a problem with that at all. That's free speech. That's the government. That's private citizens. And granted, yes, they're advocating on their own behalf. But so what? We all do. When we all engage in politics, we're usually advocating for our own well-being, right? We're usually advocating for policies that we think are best for us personally. There's nothing wrong with that at all. They just shouldn't use their uniforms. And what baffles me is why people find that even controversial. I don't know why anybody would even be upset by that position. I mean, because if they can use their uniforms to engage in politics, what next? Can the cops pick their favorite political candidate and drive them around in a squad car? Can the cops, while out on patrol, hand out flyers to people advocating a political position or advocating for a political party or advocating for a political candidate? Is that okay? I don't think that it is. Let's face it, the cops wearing their uniforms to the Fargo City Commission meeting, was a tactic. And as I mentioned previously here on the podcast and on the blog, it's not all that uncommon a tactic. Law enforcement officers typically, they'll pack legislative hearing rooms down in Bismarck. Former House Majority Leader John Dorso told me about a situation years ago where North Dakota Highway Patrol officers packed the gallery at the State House when a vote was happening on the pension. The cops do this. They know what the effect is of putting all those uniforms in the audience. And again, I don't have a problem with the cops having a position on a pension or having a position on, say, civil asset forfeiture policy or having a position, of course, on their pay. If I was a cop, I'd be concerned about that too. I'd probably want a raise too. And I'm not even against giving them the raise. Just stop using the uniform to that end. It's inappropriate. It's not why we give them the uniforms. My interview with David Owen up next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. David Owen joins me now. You may recognize his name if you follow politics in North Dakota. He was one of the organizers behind Measure 3 during the 2018 election cycle. Measure 3, of course, was an effort to legalize recreational marijuana. It was ultimately unsuccessful, but David, we went through the legislative session. The legislature didn't really produce a lot of progress on this front. And so now David and his group have said that they're back to the drawing board. They're going to put a new petition out there. They're going to make some changes to try to reflect political reality. I mean, the voters rejected something last time around, so the idea would be to craft something new that, you know, might still achieve the objective of legalized recreational marijuana, but in a fashion that a majority of voters can get behind. But what's interesting is that just recently, the Secretary of State's office sent out a press release saying that they had received a petition behind a proposed constitutional amendment. Now, that's distinct from a statutory amendment. That's what Measure 3 was. A constitutional amendment puts law in the state constitution as opposed to the North Dakota Century Code. Had received an amendment that would legalize recreational marijuana. In fact, it would because it's going in the state constitution, it essentially creates a right to grow marijuana, a right to use marijuana in any form. It also creates a mandate that the state study marijuana. It didn't survive very long, though. It was submitted to the Secretary of State's office, removed the next day after I produced a report, indicating that some of the folks on the sponsoring committee had some pretty serious criminal records, a fact that I frankly felt was important because one of the chief objections to legalizing marijuana is the idea that it's going to have this deleterious impact on crime rates. So if you're making that argument, saying, no, this is safe, this is something we can do, and it's not going to make our state more dangerous, it's hard to make that argument when you have felons on your sponsoring committee, or at least that's what I thought anyway. So I published that report. For now, that constitutional amendment is off the table, although they're saying they're going to resubmit. But David, what you're telling me, and I called you immediately because I actually thought that when this measure was, when I got the information from the Secretary of State's office, I thought Legalize ND initially was behind it. And you clarified, you said that your group has nothing to do with this.
No, we have nothing to do with the constitutional amendment to legalize marijuana. We have nothing to do with that.
Why not?
At all. So basically, the Constitution is a place where fundamental rights of democracy are enshrined. Freedom of speech, right? That's in the Constitution. The right to bear arms. That's in the Constitution. The fact that the government can't raid your house at will. That's in the Constitution. The notion that states have rights and that fundamentally rights come from individuals, not government. That's in the Constitution. The fundamental makings of our democracy is what belongs in the Constitution, as well as some structural things on how the government should work. I don't think marijuana fits the laudable criteria of freedom of speech or right to bear arms.
So you oppose it just on face value that essentially this should not be a constitutional amendment. This should be a statutory change.
To be honest with you, I'd probably vote for it. But if I were heading the ship and our group, will not be doing that.
It seems to me when I look at the amendment, Measure 3 was rejected last time around. I know you backed it. You thought it was good policy, but political reality in North Dakota is the voters said no to it. I look at what was proposed to the Secretary of State's office, and their amendment is Measure 3, but more so, right? I mean, it's a broad.
Yeah, they're trying to relitigate Measure 3.
Right. Except more so because now we're putting it in the state constitution, which has connotations beyond amending statute.
Yep. If that goes through, it can never be changed. Basically, by the legislature, it would require what?
It would require another vote of the people.
Simple majority of the people.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, my point is, I don't think the people would vote for that. I mean, as a practical matter, if you're on the side of legalizing marijuana, which both you and I are, David, I want to legalize marijuana. You want to legalize marijuana. The only thing between us is the only debate you and I would have about it would probably be how to go about doing it. This measure, I don't think it would pass. I think it would fall flat on its face. And what worries me is I'm looking from the outside looking in. I am seeing what appears to be a schism in the marijuana movement, for lack of a better term, in North Dakota. Is that happening?
I've said my piece on that other committee. I was quoted in the Tribune saying my opinions on that committee. I don't want to go into it again.
All right.
But
for my listeners, can you just reiterate what you said in the Tribune?
I said that, so when you're trying to legalize marijuana, you want to put your best foot forward. You want to show that the vast majority of people who use marijuana are not what would be considered bad dudes by the average person. They're what would be considered your average everyday person. They're doctors, they're lawyers, they're business owners. They're people that work a 9-to-5 job. They're functional members of society. When you have a committee that's, 40.5%? Is that about right? I'm not the best at math. But 40+% of fugitives, of sexual assault, which is in my opinion rape, of terrorists convicted of terrorizing. I mean, come on, man.
Yeah. Well, that's what when I did background checks on the people in there. Yeah, I found somebody with outstanding warrants from another state. I found somebody who was convicted of felony terrorizing. People who were convicted of numerous drug crimes and not marijuana crimes. I mean, it might be understandable if somebody who wants to legalize marijuana has maybe been busted for having marijuana or growing marijuana in the past. That to me doesn't bother me. I mean, somebody like that, I would understand that they want the law to change. I get that. In fact, part of your Measure 3 effort was the expungement of criminal records, but we're talking about drug arrests and drug charges that are well beyond marijuana. I mean, there is a laundry list of very serious criminal violations. I wrote about it at sayanythingblog.com. And I think you're right, David. One of the struggles to legalize marijuana is about showing that marijuana can be part of a normal society. Like it's not, the reefer madness thing is nonsense. You can use marijuana responsibly. It can be part of an upstanding citizen's life in the same way as a glass of wine with dinner is, or a beer watching the football game is. Responsible people can use this in responsible ways, and it can just be a part of our society. And I think it's hard to make that case when you have a sponsoring committee with that sort of a criminal background.
Yeah, the sponsoring committee looks more like a penitentiary than a sponsoring committee.
Yeah, well, that's problematic. So, I mean, obviously, the presence of this because they're for now they've removed their constitutional amendment, but they're saying they're going to resubmit it. So I'm going to take that at face value.
Well, you know what?
We're gonna have they're going to be competing with you, David.
Well, yes and no. There's not going to be a lot of competition, to be honest with you. That I have all the records of who did what from 3. I have the records of who collected signatures, who was actively involved. And the vast majority of the work was done in Cass County and Grand Forks County. There were a couple people in Bismarck, but the people in Bismarck who were heavily involved last time are back working on Legalize ND. They're going to carry that petition as well, but they're back on the Legalize ND initiative. And, it's unfortunate, but it's just unfortunate, Rob.
Well, I think it is. And I'll tell you, I've been involved in a lot of these sorts of movements over the years. And it's always hard to get people who are passionate about an issue to get them all marching in the same direction, because they have different priorities. They care maybe about different aspects of the policy more than others. They have different, tactics that they would like to use. It's hard. It's like herding cats. So it's never easy in any, sort of volunteer, citizen-led effort as Measure 3 was. And then, when you have to basically compete, I mean, the voters already said no to this once. So your job was already high to come back with them with something new and get them to understand that this is a different take. This is a different approach. If you have another measure that's out there being circulated, people are going to be confused, and people are going to conflate the two measures and conflate the two movements and lump you all in together.
I don't think they will, because constitutional versus statutory, and allegedly they're going on the primary ballot. I don't think they'll make it personally, but allegedly they're going to try and be on the primary ballot. So I don't think there's a cross voting problem. I think there's a messaging problem, but I kind of want to talk about our initiative if we can get the chance.
Well, sure. Let's do that. What are you planning for this time around in terms of putting in front of voters?
So the first biggest difference is it's going to be primarily written by North Dakota attorneys. We have 2 that are confirmed working on it. They say they're about 80% of the way done. We've reached out to multiple different groups who have done legalization, and basically we've got model legislation. We've got it all drafted. It's not done yet, but it's about 80% there. We have representatives from the state legislature who are going to let us use legislative counsel. It's going to go through 2 layers of checks. First, it's going to go through our private attorneys. Then it's going to go through legislative counsel, assuming that legislator holds his end of the deal. And then after that, it's going to be very different. We're not going to have unlimited grow. We're probably not going to have home grow, because home grow was a huge sticking point. About 40 to 50% of North Dakotans, closer to 50, so are totally opposed to home grow. They will not support anything with home grow attached. So, and that's what we found from our research and from what we've been doing. And so as a result, it's probably not going to have home grow in there. We're also not going to have full expungement. We believe close to 50% support expungement, but they support partial expungement. We're not going to be expunging dealers and heavy individuals. We're going to make it much more reasonable on the expungement. We're going to have permits. We're going to have track and trace. It's going to be a lot more in line with a traditional measure that's not so much libertarian, but is quite a bit more limited and controlled.
I personally, I feel like that's the right direction to go. Now, you and I, David, would probably prefer something a lot more libertarian. I know I would. I think we're ready for it.
I think we would both prefer 3, to be perfectly honest.
But the thing is we work in a society where we have to create consensus, and we've got to build consensus around something. And there are people out there who are a lot more skeptical of legalizing marijuana than you and I are. So to get those people to support us, we got to give them something, right? So there's got to be things in the measure that they can point to and feel, okay, I feel safe voting for this. So I honestly, David, I think you're heading in the right direction, and I wish you luck, and I'm looking forward to seeing the text of the measure when it's ready.
And the other big thing is that I want to stress is this one will have the ability for communities to opt out of the program. If you don't want a dispensary in your town, you don't have to have it under this new measure. There's going to be a lot of provisions for local control that allow for certain communities to say no. Thanks.
Yeah. David, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Rob.
That's it for today's Plain Talk Podcast. Thanks as always for listening. New episodes come out Monday through Friday. If you're subscribing to this on a platform that allows you to rate or review the podcast, I would appreciate it if you do so. Each new rating or review helps other people find the podcast. It really helps us out. If you ever have any feedback on the show, you want to send me questions for the guests, rob@sayanythingblog.com is the place to do that. Also, follow me on social media. I'm Rob Port on Facebook and Twitter. Say Anything Blog has a Facebook and Twitter account. Follow those to stay up to date on all the columns I'm writing, the blog posts I'm writing, and of course this podcast. And if you follow me there, say hi, because I like it when people say hi. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.